Because what you don't know about energy can kill you. Here's Alex Epstein.
Welcome to Power Hour. I'm Alex Epstein. On today's show, I'm going to be discussing the NetZero corporate movement, and I'm very happy to have on the show Rupert Darwall. Rupert is one of my favorite writers on energy and environmental issues. He wrote the books The Age of Global Warming and Green Tyranny. He's a great researcher, particularly a historical researcher, so he brings a lot of historical perspective to a lot of different issues that you'll see will be very beneficial today. And he's been doing some really good work lately on the net zero movement, specifically the net zero corporate movement. So I'm excited to have him on. I'm recording this after having had him on, so I can tell you there's a really good discussion that follows. I hope you enjoy it, and I will be back on the other side with a few more thoughts. I'm joined now by Rupert Darwall. Rupert, welcome to Power Hour.
Glad to be joining you, Alex.
So just a little bit about your background first. So you have these two impressive books, The Age of Global Warming and Green Tyranny. One thing that strikes me about them is they're just very well researched, and you really seem to be immersed. I mean, you are immersed in just the history of the thinking and the policies that brought us toward today. How did you first get interested in energy and environmental issues?
Well, Alex, actually, it was completely by accident, and it was through someone who was a very great economist, and he did a series of lectures shortly after I left Cambridge, where I studied economics. And I heard David Henderson deliver these lectures on BBC Radio, and I thought, gosh, here is an economist who talks common sense. And then years later, I happened to meet him at a think tank lunch, and he had this wonderful ability to wind one up. And he said, you don't believe in the triple bottom line, you don't believe in green growth. I said, David, what are you telling me? Why are you telling me you're the guy who sort of rubbished all this? And he kind of wound me up so much that I thought I had to write a book about it. Almost.
Wait, did he believe in that himself?
No, not at all, not at all. He was a very big critic. He was an OECD economist, chief economist of the OECD. He worked at the World Bank. He worked in advising the British government in the 1960s. I mean, he was phenomenal. And he was a big critic of corporate social responsibilities, as it was then and is now ESG. And it was through that he got into the whole issue of global warming. And in fact, he had a run-in with the IPCC about how they were looking at their scenarios, and that they were using market exchange rates, not PPP, purchasing power parities, and actually he was denounced by the IPCC. And so it was a brilliant way of kind of working me up. And he'd studied this, he sort of observed it a lot. And so I embarked on this book, and I got a lot of, I mean, you're right to say immersed, because actually I kind of downloaded from him. And so that's how I think it's really important to go into the pre-history of global warming, because what's happened with global warming, there was a pre-existing ideology, a set of beliefs, and there was the United Nations Environment Programme and so forth. And so you have to look before global warming started as politics, before 1988, when it effectively started, and look at the pre-history of it. So that's what I did in my first book. In the second book, I looked more at the continental European dimension, and in particular Sweden, the role of Sweden, because Sweden was incredibly important in kicking this all off, and it hosted the first World Environment Conference, UN Conference on the Environment in 1972. And it started the acid rain. That's when acid rain became a big issue. And then a bit later, the Swedes started with global warming. And then the German dimension, because the greening of Europe reflects the greening of Germany, which happened after unification. The Greens was founded in 1980. And the greening of Germany has led to the greening of Europe, with very, very big consequences for Europe and indeed the world, I think.
Yeah, so the greening politically, not physically.
Yeah. Politically, yeah, absolutely. The ideological greening. Yeah.
Got it. Well, the topic I want to discuss today is inspired by what I've been studying, but also you had this great paper for the Global Warming Policy Foundation. I think it's called The Climate Noose. and you talk about corporations push toward these net zero targets. And so my tentative title for our episode is The Unscientific and Suicidal Corporate Net Zero Movement, which I think captures a lot of what you discussed. But I want to start out by discussing an example of how destructive it is to try to get to net zero, which is the reality of where you're from, the UK. I think in the US, we've had a little bit of a taste of what green energy really means by learning about what's been happening in California, where I live. But in general, I think we're woefully undereducated as to the actual results of green energy around the world. So tell us a little bit about what the UK has done over the past 12, 14 years in terms of trying to reduce emissions through green energy, and then what has actually happened.
I think there are two things. One is kind of on the policy and the other is on the politics. On the policy, essentially what's happened is that the UK power system has reduced carbon dioxide emissions by two things. First of all, there's been a huge expansion of renewable energy, which has seen a big increase in energy prices. And one of the things the UK government did was to change the definition of fuel poverty, because fuel poverty was going to be driven, the measure of fuel poverty was going to be driven by rising energy prices. So what they did was change the definition of energy poverty. And the other thing is the sort of institutional framework around that. And in particular, in 2008, the British Parliament passed the Climate Change Act, and that created the Climate Change Committee, which its job is to hold, if you can believe it, the government, the democratically elected government, to account for reaching, for delivering various carbon dioxide emission reduction targets. So there are 5-yearly, what they call carbon budgets, which are really targets, rolling a 5-year targets. And initially the target was an 80% reduction in CO2 greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And last year that was up to net zero. And so what you have is a framework that forces the government into the government of the day. Any government you elected has to do the same thing, which forces you into a path of decarbonisation, irrespective of the costs. There is no kind of get out clause for saying this is actually too expensive. There's no get out clause for saying, well, actually the rest of the world isn't doing it. You have to do it. And the irony is, Alex, that Britain is part, or until Brexit, was part of the European Union's emission trading scheme. So the faster that Britain decarbonised, the more it would release carbon emissions permits for other people, for other countries in Europe. Okay, so the net effect on the climate and on CO2 emissions, all it meant was Britain sacrificed more so that Italians and Spanish or whatever could emit more. I mean, completely crazy. And these kind of, I think these aspects of climate policy are kind of not well understood, because you see a lot of states in the US saying, oh, we're going to have emissions trading, and all they're doing, if you set a tighter target, you're just letting someone else emit more. You don't actually reduce the carbon emissions, if you think that's a desirable thing. But I think it's what we've seen so far, if you like, is the easier bit of emissions reduction, which is actually like the US, which has been a switch from coal fired power stations to natural gas. So what we've had in the UK is coal has really gone down to next to nothing, and coal's only brought on when the wind isn't blowing. They fire up the coal-fired power stations to keep the lights on. So that's where we're at the moment. But there will come a point where we're past that, and there aren't any coal-fired power stations left. There aren't incentives to build gas-fired power stations, because renewables have this little understood effect on the economics of power generation, which is because they're basically fixed cost. Wind and solar are very high fixed cost, very low marginal cost, which destroys the economics of dispatchable, reliable generating capacity. So unless the government steps in and invests in that kind of capacity, the lights go out. And we're not quite there yet, but in a matter of years we will be, and the lights will go out. And at that point, all bets are off.
Well, let's talk though about, you mentioned price increases, which I think are very underrated in terms of how significant they are. As I talk about, the price of energy affects the price of everything. So you mentioned cost increases. What scale of cost increases have you seen in the UK?
You've seen. It depends which year you take, but you've seen prices going up by 50%. At the same time, wholesale prices, you have to be quite careful here, because the effect of renewables is actually rather odd. It kind of, because they depress wholesale prices at the same time as retail prices go up. So there is this strange effect of renewables on the economics of the grid. But the other thing, Alex, to take into account is what we've had in Britain is basically this has accelerated the deindustrialization and the offshoring of British manufacturing, because British manufacturers now have the highest electricity prices virtually anywhere in the world, because whereas the Germans, who were ahead of this, they've basically cross-subsidized so business basically pays less so that households pay more. So there's that effect in Germany. But Britain, manufacturers are basically being slaughtered by the energy price increases. So Britain has the highest per capita amount of imported carbon dioxide emissions, in terms of manufactured imports. So that's another thing that, kind of the climate crowd don't take into account, that actually Britain's consumption emissions are a hell of a lot higher than production emissions.
Yeah, I think this is a really crucial point, that just industry is one of the first things to disappear when your energy costs go up, because people domestically, they're going to use some energy no matter what. And the rich people can afford quite a bit. They'll still use a lot of energy if energy prices go up, but industry will generally flee. If they think for the foreseeable future it's going to be super expensive to produce anything with electricity in the UK, they're going to leave the UK. Is there documentation on the level of flight that there's been?
On the level of
a flight of industry leaving the UK.
I think, it's not so much industry leaving, it's industry not reinvesting, and just it's a sort of steady shrinkage. But I think the most compelling data is the gap between consumption emissions and production emissions. So Britain's production emissions have been falling, but the consumption emissions are basically haven't fallen. They have fallen, but they peaked and now they're back to the level they were in 1992. So you could say Britain has the worst decarbonisation record of any industrialised economy, because essentially its consumption emissions they've gone up and down, but they're back to where they were in 1992, around that date. But that, to my mind, is the most telling thing, is just the deindustrialization through outsourcing emissions to China and so forth.
Yeah, I think this is a generally completely understated phenomenon. Even in the US, if you look at what would our electricity consumption from industry look like if we had not had all of these renewable mandates? And if you look at China's industrial electricity consumption, the trajectory of that versus ours, I think ours is pretty close to flat. And theirs is really, obviously increasing very, very rapidly. If you think about the future of a nation, you don't want flat or declining industrial energy consumption.
If you want to have blue collar jobs, you want rising electricity consumption. Absolutely right. This is kind of, we're going into Joel Kotkin territory of basically the hollowing out of the blue collar stratum in society, and it's got profound economic and social implications.
Well, also if you just look even for data, what's gonna, if it's sustained more expensive or less reliable electricity, the more and more we have energy consumed by data centers, the more there's an incentive to offshore a lot of those to places that actually have cheap electricity. So one more thing I wanted to bring up about the UK that I think people aren't told about. You mentioned that the fuel poverty definition had changed. So I'd like you to talk about that, and particularly talk about that in connection with cold weather related deaths, because people think, oh, the warming is such a problem, but cold weather related deaths are a bigger problem. And I know it's a big issue in the UK as energy prices increase.
Yeah, it's a huge issue. And Britain, what's extraordinary, and we talked earlier about the institutional framework of decarbonisation, but no British government has carried out a cost-benefit analysis of climate change. And it's quite possible to believe that a country with the climate of Britain would actually be a beneficiary from mild warming.
I would say it's way more than possible.
Yeah. But you're absolutely right to mention cold weather deaths. That's tens of thousands of principally elderly people can be lose their lives because they're not over the winter months. But it's also the sheer misery that it inflicts on living in cold, damp, quite old housing stock. But what happened? It was in David Cameron's coalition government from about 2010, which started in 2010, when they had a big push on climate, and they realized that climate policies were going to push up electricity prices. And there'd been a previous government had promised to abolish energy poverty. So they thought, how can we get rid of this? We've got this problem. There's this thing about abolishing energy poverty. So the obvious thing is you change the definition of energy poverty. And it was about, instead of being about people, they defined it around buildings and the extent to which a building, a house or an apartment or whatever, could be insulated. And so they just shifted. You weren't actually measuring poverty as it affects people, but poverty as it affects building. And so it was claimed was more policy relevant, because the idea was that you cut emissions by insulating buildings. So that's what they did, and then from that moment on, they stopped the increase in energy poverty. I mean, if it was any other field but climate change, you can imagine the political outrage there would be, the government fiddling the numbers. If it was unemployment or healthcare or anything like that, it would be all over the papers. But there's been hardly a word, no protest about it at all.
I mean, among better researchers, what has been documented in terms of cold weather deaths and cold weather misery as energy prices have gone up?
Oh, there are numbers on that. I think, particularly in the current environment, it's a very, with COVID and so forth, it's really back of mind. I mean, that's not, by the nature of the pandemic and the excess deaths and so forth, you're not seeing, it's just everything's overwhelmed by COVID. So you're not, for the next, we've had COVID now for 9 months, and we'll have it for at least another 4 or 5 months. So it's very much back of mind. But it's not the story, even in a normal year, it's not the story you would expect, because if you do things, if it's about climate sort of trumps everything. It just sacrifices everything because saving the planet is the most important thing.
Just one more thing on that. I mean, shouldn't it be relevant in COVID times? I mean, we see, during cold and flu season, COVID spreads a lot worse. And so you would think that people's ability to be warm and comfortable would affect the spread and severity of COVID.
Yeah, you would. And also the public health advice is to keep windows open, isn't it? So it runs completely against public health and the decarbonisation run completely counter to each other. So you should actually be turning up the heat in your homes, and you should be opening the windows to let them. But it's really expensive to do that, and it's a cold winter. It's been quite cold recently, so it's not pleasant.
Yeah, I mean this is. I wish maybe there's a good resource on this, but I've thought a lot about how the reality of COVID has just refuted all of these green myths, or maybe more accurately, has shown a lot of these green practices to be self-destructive. So if you think about over commitment to energy efficiency at the expense of ventilation, and ventilation is a key issue, or you think about, what's the thing we should really be doing is a massive increase in temperature control and opening the windows. So I'm proud to say I live in a very modest climate, or moderate climate, but I ran air conditioning and opened the windows during the summer, and I run heat, and we don't really have much of a winter, but I run heat and open the windows during the colder times, and I would no matter, and I'm willing to spend the money on that because that's the valuable thing for health. And nobody's saying, hey, you know what, if we increased our carbon footprint in heating and air conditioning, we could really save a lot of lives. Like, nobody's talking about that's obvious from the science of it.
Well, you're absolutely right. The other thing is mass transit and the auto.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a big one. The Greens want very dense cities, because whereas public health, you want actually cities spread out, and the suburbs are good. So there is a big tension. There's a big contradiction between public health and decarbonisation. You're absolutely right. This is a big topic which the progressives haven't got their heads around yet.
Yeah, not to mention, I mean, the hand dryers, you're seeing those go out of style. The grocery bags, the green grocery bags that are bacteria traps. It's just like, but there wasn't any admission that, hey, we've been encouraging you to do something unhealthy, which a lot of us on the pro-human side had been saying for years. Hey, these are anti-human measures. But let's jump in now to this corporate movement to net zero. And one thing I really enjoyed about your paper is that you talk about the origins of net zero, logical or pseudo-logical, including this 1.5 degree Celsius target. Because I think most people think of it as, oh, this is a scientifically determined number. The UN found out that if we don't limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which, by the way, it means 0.5 from where we are now, because we've already hit 1 from pre-industrial levels. So if it warms half a degree, the world is going to end. And, the AOC comment, and you're worried about the cost. So what's the actual origin of this number that I would say uncharitably the business world has just completely capitulated to and not questioned? Like where does this come from? This 1.5?
I don't think that's not, Alex, I wouldn't say that's an unfair comment at all about capitulation. They have completely capitulated, and they haven't raised the hood and looked under what's there. The 1.5, before 1.5, it was 2 degrees, and the 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, which is actually the giveaway, isn't it? Because what have pre-industrial levels got to do with anything? I mean, we don't even know what they really are. The baseline for all this is actually very difficult to determine. And it came about because European environment ministers decided, 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels is the right thing. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has this thing about to avoid dangerous anthropogenic change. So we should go back there. So then what happened was that European environment ministers had to say, well, what is dangerous anthropogenic climate change? And they decided 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, right? There's no scientific basis to that at all. That is what the environment ministers decided. Then there was a campaign launched by the Alliance of Small Island States to say 2 degrees is too much, our islands are drowning. And if you remember, before the Copenhagen Climate Conference in 2009, the president of the Maldives he put on some scuba kit and he held a cabinet meeting. You remember all that hoo-ha? And it was all a push for 1.5 degrees. Copenhagen was a disaster because the Indians and the Chinese and Brazilians, South Africans said, no, we're not going to sign up to this. But they kept on going with this PR campaign, and it got written into the Paris Agreement in 2015. I remember being at the Paris conference, and if you ever go to these the UN climate change things, they're basically a huge, great trade fair of the climate industrial complex. So you have these pavilions of countries and companies or whatever. And I remember seeing there was a little fake demonstration, and Todd Stern, the US negotiator, was in it, and they were all chanting sort of 1.5 to stay alive and whatever. I mean, just complete rubbish. And so it got written into the text. So then having the politicians, if you like, and the NGOs and whatever, having written it into the text, then the IPCC was asked to justify what had already been decided by politics. Now, this whole thing of small island states, small islands, coral atolls disappearing under the waves, I was always suspicious of this because some time ago, I read Charles Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle. And if you haven't read it, I strongly recommend that you do, because it's one of the greatest works of scientific mind. And it's also not in equations or algebra or anything. It's written in plain English. It's the most incredible book. And as they went through, as the Beagle sailed through the Pacific Islands, and the Indian Ocean, Darwin asked himself, how is it coral atolls are formed? And he hypothesized they're formed by the slow subsidence of the seabed. So it's actually, if you like, rising sea levels that help create coral atolls. And modern science has confirmed Darwin's intuition that is how coral atolls are formed. And lo and behold, what we find is that most coral atolls have been have been growing in size. So the whole thing about 1.5, which was based on coral atolls being submerged by rising seas, it's fake science. It's completely untrue. It's without foundation. Yet the whole world has swallowed this unscientific, anti-scientific belief. And that's what it's been. We've been basically sunk, if you like, by a really brilliant PR campaign that has no scientific basis to it whatsoever. That's how we got here.
So let's dive into a couple of things. So one thing is, so with this coral atoll thing, if you think about the Maldives and some other places, which by the way, Maldives is like, vacation, people are going scuba diving there, but just because it's a great vacation spot still. But if you just think about logically, okay, even if there were a concern about certain very small island nations will be overwhelmed in 50 years or whatever it is, you would think that you would ask, well, what's the cost of preventing that? Like, what's the cost of, if it were even true? And one thing you pointed out about the 1.5 degree report, which came out, I believe, in 2018, is that there's no serious consideration of the costs of climate policy. And I couldn't even believe it was this bad, but I looked into it. So I read through the entire, not the whole report, but I read through the entire summary by policymakers or for policymakers. And I didn't see even one reference to the cost of these climate policies, like to the actual, and they're talking about eliminating net emissions by 2050. Could you comment on just the lack of a cost benefit analysis at all?
Yeah, I mean, it is absolutely, it is staggering that there is no cost benefit analysis whatsoever. But it's not surprising, because if there was a cost benefit analysis, it would show that the thing's not worth doing. And you wouldn't have 1.5, you wouldn't have 2 degrees either. There were some indicative numbers of, if you like, shadow carbon prices, and they are really eye-popping. So for 2030, the cost of you need a carbon tax to reach 1.5 of up to $6,050 a ton. People complain about carbon taxes of $50 or $100 a ton, but you're talking about an order of magnitude higher than that, 6,050.
So how does that translate? So like, is it? I forget what it is. So how does that translate to like a gallon of gasoline?
I haven't, Alex. I haven't worked that out. I mean, I haven't worked that out. But to compare, if you look at the Clinton administration did a social cost of carbon exercise to justify the Clean Power Plan, and when you put, it came out about $50 a ton, and when you put them on the same basis as the estimates in the IPCC for the carbon tax, it's equivalent to $94 a ton. And so you're really comparing $94 a ton of, and that's an estimate of the damages from the marginal ton of carbon dioxide, compared to taxing it up to $6,050 a ton. Shows you how this is an absolutely crazy, irrational, anti-human welfare policy. I mean, when you stand by it, this is something done by fanatics. It's not by people who are concerned about human welfare, because those numbers should give anyone pause for thought. They show a destruction of human welfare on an absolutely extraordinary scale.
Now, does the UN use those numbers?
Yeah, that's from the IPCC report.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, that's
so it's not formally a cost benefit analysis, but those numbers are, you'll find those numbers in the report. It's also in my report. And that should give anyone pause for thought about the rights and wrongs of embarking on this course, because it really will make the destruction, as I say, destruction of welfare is absolutely colossal, mind-boggling.
Yeah, so you mentioned fanatics, and it definitely has this religious quality to it, where it's saying we need to reach this number without any regard to the consequences of reaching this number. So the idea is the number is an end in itself. And you might think, well, how is that, like, where is that coming from? And I think some of the quotes you have in this report from them reveal the religious character. So I just want to read a couple of them that you had. Let's see. So one is maybe here are the two that I found most revealing. One is the overarching context of this report is this: human influence has become a principal agent of change on the planet. And so to me, that just smacks of this is the whole green morality of thou shalt not impact the planet. Like to them, the whole context is we're having a lot of impact, and they're not differentiating between positive and negative impact, even though our overall impact on the planet has been amazingly positive. That's why we have dramatically increased life expectancy, dramatically increased income, and dramatically increased population. And then the other thing that confirms that they're not concerned with human life, and I could not believe this, so I had to read the report just to confirm you weren't misquoting them, is the summary, their entire summary of the positives of industrial civilization or fossil fuel civilization. So here's what it says: global economic growth has been accompanied by increased life expectancy and income in much of the world. However, in addition to environmental degradation and pollution, many regions remain characterized by significant poverty and severe inequality in income distribution and access to resources, amplifying vulnerability to climate change. So I just want to put it in context. The world has had unprecedented improvement for the last 200 years. I mean, life expectancy has gone from 30 to over 70. Your opportunity to live a fulfilling life is completely unimaginable to somebody who lived 100, let alone 200 years ago. The world, and their whole thing has been accompanied by increased life expectancy and income, and they can't even give that one sentence. They have a semicolon. However, in addition to environmental degradation and pollution, many regions remain characterized by significant poverty, which, as you point out, is because they haven't industrialized. So if this is your characterization of industrial life, you are not thinking about it in a pro-human way. What's your take?
I've read a lot of IPCC reports, and this one is overtly ideological. I mean, it is ideology. It's using science. It doesn't hide its ideological purpose. And it talked about 1.5 as creating the opportunity for intentional societal transformation. Now, that is an ideological project. And as you point out, the anti-capitalist, anti-industrialization bias is so strong, they don't hide it. And what I find most unsettling is that we call them policymakers, but it's governments around the world have accepted this completely uncritically. They just, oh, the science says, so we've got to do it. And the science of the 1.5 report, and I'm not really traducing it at all, is basically saying that the physical consequences of 1.5 are less than going to 2 degrees.
Yeah, that is basically what it amounts to.
That's all it is. You don't need a bunch of scientists to tell it. As I say, a child could have told them that. That's all it is. That is the sort of that's the bottom line scientific content of the 1.5 report. But the rest of it's ideological. Now, in terms of the Paris Agreement, which has come in for a lot of criticism, and I'm very critical of it, there is a get-out clause that everyone's forgotten, which is, I'll read it out to you, recognizing that parties may be affected not only by climate change, but also by the impacts of the measures taken in response to it. Now, that is the most important, a breath of fresh air in otherwise a completely insane framework. Because these policies are going to be far more destructive than anything brought about by climate change. And not just destructive on human welfare, but on the environment. If you go and we've seen the palm oil plantations and the destruction of habitats, wind and solar, and just how they destruction of habitats there, and so we're going to see huge environmental degradation. From a battery manufacture, all the rare earths and stuff, the cobalt mining there'll be in Africa and so forth. It's going to be horrendous. And so the world is on this course, which is both destructive of human welfare and also the environment. And there's nothing at the moment. There's no one putting their hand up saying, look, hey, let's look at this and look at the origins of this and where it came from. And it came from a deeply ideological report produced by the IPCC.
So we have an anti-human, anti-industry like religion or ideology or philosophy producing this report. Now let's talk about the response of particularly industrial companies. What has their response been, at least public companies, with this ESG movement?
Well, I think one has to distinguish between industrial companies and Wall Street, if you like, because Wall Street it's very easy for Wall Street to decarbonize because their production emissions are tiny and their energy costs as a percent of their income statement are, fractions of a percentage point. So it's very easy for them to be climate virtuous. Although, having said that, if you look at consumption emissions of a Wall Street banker, they're going to be stratospheric. But everyone looks at production.
Well, what about
emissions.
what they're funding? They're giving the fuel for. All of industry is funded by finance, so you could just account. It's all how you account for it.
Yeah, but what they're doing is they're saying, well, the greening of finance, the weaponization of finance. So industrial companies are basically being given notice by Wall Street. You have got to adopt net zero targets, otherwise your access to capital is going to be curtailed. Otherwise, the next proxy season, we're going to vote against your board of directors and so forth. So you've got this, if you like, this parallel form of government out of Wall Street regulating the activities of American corporations. And that, I think, raises two profound issues. The first is just to do with democratic legitimacy. You either have governments that are democratically accountable, or should government be run from Wall Street by unaccountable Wall Street titans and index fund managers such as BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and so forth. The other one, and this is just a practical one, is that climate policy is made by nation states. It's the jurisdiction of states. And corporations are not their activities are not coterminous with a state. They're multinationals. So if you're regulating a large American corporation's carbon footprint, its scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, those are all around the world. And effectively you're saying in parts of the world which aren't subject to strict climate policy, you're effectively pushing them out of those territories, out of those markets. So it's a way of shrinking. The unintended effect is that you will see American corporations being pushed out of some of the fastest growing markets in the world. That is that's if they stick to net zero. And all that what's got to happen is demand in those countries for energy has to be capped. If it's not capped, all that happens is some other company is going to supply what those consumers and those economies want. And all you're doing is penalizing American corporations for no climate gain at all.
This movement has been just unbelievably successful, the ESG movement, in terms of affecting corporations. What would you advise, like today's public corporations who see some of the problems with the net zero targets? What would you advise them to do?
I think the first thing they should do is be very clear what the cost is to their business, to their employers, and to their stockholders. They should just tell people, you want us to do this, but this will be the cost. We anticipate this will be the cost. Instead of what they kind of do is say, we agree with these targets and humming and hawing and sort of going along with them. I think they should be very, very clear what the costs of these are to their employees and to their stockholders.
What do you expect to be the reality of, if you look over the next 30 years, like let's say everyone tries their hardest? What do you expect to be the reality of net zero? Because I certainly don't think it's going to be achieving net zero in the world. Like what do you think is going to happen?
I think what will happen is actually you wrote a brilliant article on this with respect to Apple and renewable energy certificates, because that's the bit that kind of people forget when they talk about net zero. They think, oh, well, these companies are actually going to achieve net zero. What actually will happen is a huge, great fake market in carbon credits and offsets and so forth. That is really what will happen, because for a lot of processes, you can't decarbonize. So it will create this completely phony market in, just as with renewable energy certificates, a completely phony market so that that companies can say we're net zero, we're not harming the, and it's just be shelling out. It's like the toll for the troll, isn't it? That's what will happen, and it's not going to make. It just means that it's like a tax on industrial activity, and it's going to enrich some people. Some people are going to make an absolute ton of money out of that, but the rest of the world is going to be poorer for it.
I mean, one thing I think will happen if you look at the government and the corporate policies is just certain people will engage in this unilateral self-sacrifice, and then at a certain point, it'll just be too costly, and then they'll stop. I mean, particularly if you look at, maybe we could talk about China for a few minutes. You just wrote a really great article about China summarizing a different paper, I think from Patricia Adams from the Global Warming Policy Foundation. Like, what do you expect China's trajectory to be over the coming decades? Because people have the idea, oh, they're out competing us with wind turbines and solar panels.
China is a massively it's a hydrocarbon fueled economy, and you have to ask: is the Chinese Communist Party going to put at risk the growth of the Chinese economy to save the planet? And the obvious, the answer is no. The other thing to bear in mind is that the CCP have a target for the 100th anniversary of its seizure of power in 1949. So in 2049, it wants to be the world's dominant economy. So if you work back from that, what would you do if you were going to script world dominance for China in 2049? What would you script? Well, you'd script something very much like net zero for the rest of the world, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I mean, there are two ways to compete. You can elevate yourself and destroy others.
Yeah, and at the same time make energy cheaper for your own economy, because as demand for coal and natural gas goes down elsewhere, it makes it cheaper for you. That's what will.
So I just talk for a second about it, because people might think it's conspiracy theory, but there's reason to believe that they're deliberately encouraging others to adopt decarbonization policies, right?
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is that they are the world's largest manufacturer of solar panels. They've also got a big position in wind turbines. So I think it's all consistent with the Chinese Communist Party seeing this as a huge strategic opportunity to both keep their economy powering along and, in relative terms, just to be the biggest economy in the world by mid-century.
And this just has all. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I think the other thing that I haven't mentioned is just their biggest rival in the region is India, the other billion people population country, and net zero completely sinks India, because unlike China, India has hardly carbonized. What India needs to do really, really badly is to go full throttle on fossil fuels, and net zero denies India what China has gained. So that's another obvious win for China.
I mean, if you look historically, we look in the past and we see situations like Neville Chamberlain, and we think, oh, the people back then were such suckers, or how could they believe this? And that's what I feel about today's decarbonization movement from a security standpoint. Like, oh, it's so clear that this is a stupid idea in terms of forcing people to use these uneconomic technologies that make energy unaffordable and unreliable wherever they're used. And like, clearly China, and I would also say Russia, like they don't want us to all mutually succeed. At least a lot of the leaders don't. And so it's just this clear strategy. Yeah. If you de-energize your competitors with these terrible ideas and terrible policies, and then you energize yourself, it's this huge thing. And there is this useful idiot thing going on where it's just like, we seem to be playing into their hands. And even just, I think one point you made in your article, or if you didn't, it's a good point anyway, is just, what is the level of economic dependence on China for most of the solar and wind economy and battery economy in terms of the raw materials and in terms of the processing facilities? It puts any former Mideast dependence on oil to shame, right?
That's true. And the other thing is, when you think, as you mentioned, Mideast oil, since the Nixon presidency, the aim of every successive administration has been energy independence. And lo and behold, thanks to fracking, the US has achieved it, and now it's going to throw it away. It's absolutely extraordinary. I think the other effect is, it's almost like, I think the most insidious thing in terms of national security, the effect on national security, is if you believe climate change is an existential threat, you no longer see China, for example, as a threat to your national security. You actually see China as a necessary partner to save the world from the catastrophe of climate change. In other words, it kind of paralyzes the national security elites to think about what the real threats are to American security and the security of the West. And that's incredibly damaging. I think that's going to be one of the big issues for the Biden administration. I mean, you've got John Kerry, who thinks that climate change science is as simple as an apple falling off a tree, and that we're facing a climate catastrophe. And if you think that, well, you can kiss goodbye to Taiwan, for example, you're basically giving China a blank check in that part of the world. And that's the real national security threat.
Yeah, and I would just even go beyond that. If you look at this kind of myopia that you have when you're fixated on one issue. So policy-wise, it's going to affect you not looking at other threats. But it's not just foreign policy threats. I mean, even domestic policy. Who was thinking about pandemics? I remember when I was working on a version of my book that's going to come out later this year, and I had antibiotic resistance as something on my mind that, oh, this is something much more serious than, mild climate impact. But you can only if you're obsessed with one thing, you can't focus on other things. So there's the political level, just being unprepared for things like pandemics. But then if you look at the business level, and I think you make this point in your piece, that do we really want our corporations just monomaniacally focused on this one thing? And this one thing is basically how not to emit CO2. It's not a new creative purpose. It's not newer and better ways of producing energy. It's just trying to do the exact same thing, or a less or even a worse version of the exact same thing without emitting CO2. So we have a whole corporate world now that's not focused, or that's less focused on real innovation. And instead they're focused on meeting this religious target of net zero. That has huge negative consequences for innovation going forward.
Alex, I completely agree with you. And one of the points I try and make is that ESG basically turns corporations into arms of government. They are being tasked to deliver public policy goals. And in my view, you need a separation of functions between government on the one side and the role of governments to regulate and to achieve public policy goals, and the role of corporations. And the role of corporations is to innovate, to compete successfully in a dynamic marketplace, to keep their eye on the market. And if you turn companies into box-ticking public sector bureaucracies, the motive force, the kind of energy and dynamism of capitalism will just be drained away. And we'll just have, kind of flat growth, very little innovation, and the whole thing will stagnate. And big threat in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, imagine Amazon at the beginning being obsessed with, oh, we can't emit any CO2. Like, well, they would have just done nothing.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, Rupert. Well, thanks so much for coming on. Where can people learn more about your work and follow your work?
That's a good question. I'm a senior fellow at the Royal Clear Foundation, so I write regularly on Real Clear Energy. So that all my stuff is on the Real Clear Energy pages. And the article you mentioned on China, for example, I think that went up just before Christmas, and it's very easy to find.
And then Twitter, you're Rupert Darwall, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Any final messages?
If we're allowed to remain on Twitter, Alex.
Yeah, that's a whole other discussion. Any final messages for the audience?
Yeah, I think the most important thing in this debate is to have a debate and to keep talking and to keep thinking and not be intimidated or downcast by, we're going to have a great big wave of with the incoming Biden administration of climate hysteria and so forth, and just to keep talking and keep reading and keep the messages coming out and keep a clear thinking about it.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks so much, Rupert.
My pleasure.
Thanks again to Rupert Darwall for joining me on the show. I want to harp on one point that I probably harped on a little bit during the interview as well, but just how bad and irrational the UN IPCC is, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, this is a tricky point for the following reason. It's true that the IPCC reports themselves, if you compare them to the summaries for policymakers, are much better. So they're much better than the summaries for policymakers. And there's probably some good science in the reports, and some of it is presented in a way that conveys a genuine interest in science. But what is really emerging for me, the more I read of these and the more I really read them from the perspective of, are they giving us the full context, is they are just systematically not giving us the full context. They do not look at the world. I mean, and it's at least two things. They do not look at the world from a human flourishing perspective. They really look at it from a minimal impact or unimpacted nature perspective. And so that's one. So it's the whole moral framework that's shaping it is the idea that we should be optimizing for having as little impact on the planet, including the global climate system, as possible. So it's that corrupt idea. And then related in terms of methodology, they're not looking at the benefits and the side effects for human flourishing at all carefully. They're ignoring the benefits of fossil fuels, and that's manifested by ignoring the costs of rapidly eliminating fossil fuels. And so this is just as valid as a document that looked at COVID-19 vaccines and only looked at the potential side effects and not the potential benefits, or that said we're going to outlaw all vaccination, and they did not look at what that would do negatively. So if you know that somebody has a bad methodology, and then on top of that and related to that, they have the wrong standard, then everything they say is going to be distorted. I just want to really stress that the leading body that we are relying upon, and that our all of our different knowledge institutions are relying upon, is bankrupt in terms of its basic methodology. So we can still point out that, yeah, even this entity, when it on specific issues in isolation, is acknowledging that climate change is not the end of the world, and that can be valid to point out, and I like pointing that out. But I just want to really make clear that the UN IPCC has very bad methodology, and they are not thinking of this issue from remotely a pro-human perspective, both from the perspective of standard and from the related perspective of method. I think the more we are aware of that, the more we can resist falling prey toward these kinds of listen to the scientists type things. Because no, this is not a scientific thing. It's not a rational thing. It's not a pro-human thing. It's a very religious thing. And scientists are sometimes unwittingly, sometimes deliberately being co-opted into this. But nevertheless, this is really the religion of minimize human impact on the planet. This is not trying to maximize human flourishing and then integrating our impacts on climate into that analysis. So just want to properly bash the UN. And I mean, the UN in general deserves a lot of bashing, but the IPCC in particular is just, it is a bankrupt institution in terms of its basic conception and methodology for the reasons that I gave and that I talked about on this show. All right. Hope you find that helpful. As always, if you have any questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail, you can email me at alex@alexepstein.com. Make sure you're on my mailing list, which you can get on at alexepsteinlist.com. If you want to support our work at the Center for Industrial Progress, specifically our research and development and our promotional efforts, you can become an accelerator at industrialprogress.com/accelerate. We have one of our bi-monthly accelerator calls this Sunday. I think it's the 17th. So if you're an accelerator at any amount and you have been one over the last year, you're welcome to attend. I think that'll be a really interesting call. All right, that is it for this week. Next week, I'll be back with another great guest. Until then, I'm Alex Epstein. This has been Power Hour.
Power Hour. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of energy. Power Hour. The antidote to shallow thinking about energy issues.